Be-Bop-A-Lula, she's my baby. Be-Bop-A-Lula, don't mean maybe. Be-Bop-A-Lula, she's my baby. Be-Bop-A-Lula, don't mean maybe.
In the summer of 1956, a strange new voice came over American radios. It wasn't smooth like the crooners, or bright like the pop singers. It was slurred, echo-drenched, half-whispered and half-howled, wrapped around a nonsense title that somehow felt like it meant something. Be-Bop-A-Lula.
Be-Bop-A-Lula, she's my baby. Be-Bop-A-Lula, don't mean maybe. Be-Bop-A-Lula, she's
The record shot up the charts, sold over 1 million copies, and turned a young singer from Norfolk, Virginia, into one of rock and roll's first dark icons. To understand how that voice got on tape in the first place, you have to go back to the shipyards of Norfolk, a restless teenager named Vincent Eugene Craddock, and a motorcycle accident that would shape everything that followed. Gene Vincent entered the world as Vincent Eugene Craddock on February 11, 1935, in Norfolk, Virginia, a port city whose life revolved around the Navy, the shipyards, and the bars that serviced both. His family was working class, shuttled between Norfolk and nearby communities, chasing work as the country climbed out of the Depression and into World War II. Like a lot of kids in that world, he grew up surrounded by sailors, jukeboxes, and the sound of whatever the bar down the street was playing. On the radio and in those bars, he heard country music, gospel songs, and the growing thump of rhythm and blues, all the ingredients that would later swirl together into rockabilly. He took to the guitar early, but there was nothing in his childhood to suggest a future star. He was one more kid in a Navy town, restless, half in love with the sea, half in love with the noise pouring out of the jukebox speakers. Like so many other young men in Norfolk, Vince Craddock followed the obvious path. As a teenager, he joined the U.S. Navy, trading neighborhood streets for ship decks and long stretches at sea. He reportedly enlisted around the time of the Korean War, serving in the Pacific. The work was hard, the discipline strict, but there was music even there. Informal shows, guitars in the mess, songs traded between sailors from all over the country. Then, while back home on leave in 1955, everything changed. One night in Norfolk, Craddock was riding his motorcycle when he was hit by a car. The crash shattered his left leg so badly that doctors considered amputating it. He kept the leg, but it never healed correctly. He would wear a steel brace and live with chronic pain for the rest of his life. The Navy eventually discharged him as disabled. The accident took away the life he'd been heading toward, but it also pinned him in place in Norfolk with a small disability payment, a damaged body, and his guitar. Out of that combination came the songs, the band, and the sound that would soon be called Gene Vincent and his Blue Caps. The bars and dance halls down by the docks were always looking for music, and if you could keep sailors dancing and drinking, there was gas money to be made. Vince Craddock started sitting in with local bands, then fronting his own, pulling together a repertoire of country, hillbilly boogie, and rhythm and blues. It was loud, rough, and not yet anything you'd call professional, but there was something unmistakable in his voice. According to stories he told later, the seed of Be-Bop-A-Lula had come earlier, while he was still in the hospital recovering from the crash. Gene liked to say he and a fellow patient, Donald Graves, worked out the song together. A nonsense phrase, part baby talk, part jazz slang, wrapped around a slow, grinding beat. They were thinking of the kind of tune that would work in a bar full of lonely sailors, something half romantic and half dangerous. The truth of who wrote what would become complicated once the song started earning real money. But what matters here is that by the time Craddock was back on Norfolk stages, he had a song. A strange, hypnotic thing he could stretch out over 5 minutes if the crowd was right. The turning point came at a local radio station. Norfolk's country and western outlet liked to run talent contests, cheap ways to fill airtime and spot potential local draws. Craddock entered one of these contests, singing under his own name with a pickup band. The station's DJ and promotions man, a colorful character who billed himself as Sheriff Tex Davis, was in the middle of it all, emceeing, judging, listening for something he could use. Davis heard the raw power in Vince's voice and the response from the crowd. Before long, he was managing him, talking about records, and helping shape a band that looked and sounded like nothing else in the Tidewater bar scene. They took the name the Blue Caps, a nod to the Navy caps all over Norfolk, and a sign that this was a sailor's band, born out of the same streets and bars that fed the shipyards. With Sheriff Tex working angles at the radio station and in the business community, Gene and the Blue Caps cut a demo. Among the songs was their barroom showpiece, Be-Bop-A-Lula. The tape didn't sound polished, but it sounded alive. Davis started shopping it around to labels, and it landed on the desk of Capitol Records, which already had big country acts and pop crooners, but was hungry for something that could answer this wild new energy coming out of Memphis. Capitol's country and pop producer, Ken Nelson, heard the demo and decided to take a chance. He signed GENE Vincent to a contract and brought him, and a different version of the Blue Caps, to Nashville in early 1956. In that first Capitol session, they cut the song Nelson thought would be the A-side, a track called Woman Love, a slinky number that fit more neatly into what the label already understood as teen material. Then they turned to the oddball, Be-Bop-A-Lula. What went to tape that day sounded like nothing else in the catalog. Gene sang it loose and slurred, drifting in and out of the beat, his voice soaked in echo, pleading, bragging, laughing all at once. Behind him, the Blue Caps did more than keep time. Cliff Gallop's guitar darted and stung, throwing out flurries of notes that would make future guitar players sit up straight and hit rewind. Capitol released the record with Woman Love on the A-side and Be-Bop-A-Lula tucked on the B, but the kids, the jukebox operators, and the DJs knew immediately which side mattered. By the end of 1956, Be-Bop-A-Lula had sold over 1 million copies, pushed Gene onto national television, and made GENE Vincent and his Blue Caps one of the most explosive live acts in America. The man with the damaged leg from Norfolk, now renamed GENE Vincent by the label, had his foot wedged in the door of history.
Blue jean baby with your big blue eyes. I don't want you looking at other guys. Got to make you give me one more chance. I can't keep.
He and the Blue Caps started popping up on network TV, on the same kind of variety shows that had introduced Elvis Presley to America just months earlier. Under the hot lights, the contrast was obvious. Elvis in bright jackets and sharp suits. Gene in black, almost always black, with a noticeable limp and a stare that seemed to see something invisible far away. On television, it gave him an odd, compelling presence. He leaned into the mic, tilted his head, and let the Blue Caps explode around him.
Blue jean baby baby, give me more, baby, blue jean bop, baby, blue jean bop, baby, blue jean bop, baby, won't you bop the jeans? I'll rock on now.
If Elvis had been rock and roll's golden boy, Gene Vincent was something murkier, an early prototype of the dark rocker, dressed in black, keeping his movements tight, because every step hurt. Audiences didn't know the medical backstory. They just knew when he sang, the room changed. Other records from that first wave, Race with the Devil, Blue Jean Bop, Crazy Legs, didn't all match the chart success of Be-Bop-A-Lula, but they built the band's legend. Critics and collectors who would reissue these sides years later treated the first two Blue Caps albums like sacred texts, pointing to the interplay between Gene and Cliff Gallup as some of the most explosive rockabilly ever put on tape. On the road, the band were young, suddenly famous, and expected to deliver that storm night after night in dance halls, roller rinks, and theaters that weren't sure whether rock and roll was the future or a passing nuisance. Backstage, the conditions were simpler. Bad pay, long drives, cheap motels, and almost everywhere, access to alcohol. Underneath the screams and camera flashes, pain was a constant. The Navy pension acknowledged the damage, but it didn't erase it. By all accounts, Gene's leg hurt every day. Standing, walking, performing, everything cost him something. Touring in the 1950s meant hard benches, cramped cars, and no physical therapy. Just whatever relief you could find at the next stop. For Gene, that relief increasingly came in a bottle. Friends and fellow musicians would later describe a pattern that started early and never really stopped. A few drinks to steady the nerves before going on stage. A few more to come down afterward. And over time, a baseline of drinking to get through the day, numbing both the old injury and the new pressures.
Well, let's shake it, baby, shake it, baby, shake it. Until your mama and your papa come home. I seen a roll, baby, roll, till you satisfy my soul. I just love your sexy way. Girl, you're upside down, all around. Anyway, you do it, baby. Oh, baby, do it, baby. Oh, baby, do it, baby. I just love your sexy way.
America's first wave of rock and roll would crest quickly. Within a few years, Elvis would be in the Army. Buddy Holly would be gone. Some pioneers would be pushed into country or pop music. Gene Vincent's path would bend in a different direction, to Britain and Europe, to a new generation of fans who embraced him as a cult hero, even as his body and band slowly came apart. In 1960, Gene Vincent traveled to the UK for package tours and theater shows, often paired with fellow US rocker Eddie Cochran. In British towns and cities, kids who'd only heard these voices on records suddenly had them in the room. For a generation of future musicians, boys who would become the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Who. Seeing Gene Vincent in black leather, clutching the mic and howling Be-Bop-A-Lula was a revelation. Where American press sometimes treated rock and roll as a fad or a problem, British audiences treated Gene and Eddie like royalty, the real thing from across the ocean. The two men built a strong camaraderie on the road. Cochran was younger, blonde, and technically dazzling. Gene was darker, rougher, a little frayed. Together, they sold out halls and gave the British press plenty to write about. Wild American rockers, youth gone mad, Yankee crazies invading polite society. For Gene, the reception was a kind of vindication. Back home, he was slipping down the bill. Here, he was treated as a headliner. But on the night of April 16, 1960, after a show in Bristol, Gene Vincent and Eddie Cochran climbed into a hired car with songwriter Sharon Sheely. Just after midnight, on Roden Hill, the driver lost control. The car skidded, slammed into a concrete post, and crumpled. Eddie Cochran suffered severe head injuries. He died in hospital the next day, April 17th, at just 21 years old. Sharon Sheely was badly hurt but survived. Gene Vincent was thrown against the interior. His already damaged left leg struck again. He left the crash alive, but once more broken, with more injuries layered on top of the ones from Norfolk. Some accounts say this accident left him with further complications in his hip and back, adding to the chronic pain that would follow him for the rest of his life. For Britain's young rock and roll fans, the crash on Roden Hill was a shock. Eddie Cochran was gone, and Gene Vincent injured again, now carrying the memory of his friend's death along with his own scars. For Gene himself, it was the second great turning point in a life already shaped by impact and aftermath. He would keep touring in Europe, keep recording, and in many ways become more beloved overseas than in the country of his birth. But the combination of new trauma and old injuries, and an ever-deepening reliance on alcohol and pills, would push him down a path that no amount of applause could really fix. His last album for Capitol, Crazy Times, came out in 1960, edging toward a slightly more modern sound, but failing to make a chart dent in the US. After that, his studio work scattered across labels. None of these records matched the impact of his 50s work. Still, the records mattered. They kept his name alive in the racks and on jukeboxes, even if the royalty checks weren't large. More importantly, they gave European fans something to chase: odd imports and alternate pressings, records with different sleeves. Doctors prescribed him medications, and friends and bandmates recall him mixing those pills with alcohol long before anyone used the phrase self-medicating. By the end of the 1960s, he was a living legend in the most literal sense, revered by a small but fervent circle of fans and musicians, largely ignored by mainstream radio, and carrying his own history around like extra weight on his shoulders. Behind the stage lights and the leather, Gene Vincent's private life was just as turbulent as his career. He married 4 different times in barely a decade. His first marriage, to Ruth Hand, began and ended in 1956, the same year Be-Bop-A-Lula hit. A second marriage to Darlene Hicks in 1958 lasted until 1961. They had a son together, Gene Jr. Shortly after, in 1963, he married Margaret Russell in Britain. They would have a daughter named Sherry Ann, but that marriage too would fall apart within 2 years. By 1966, Vincent was married again, this time to singer Jackie Frisco, whom he'd met through the music world. Between the marriages, the constant touring, and his worsening health, home life was often chaotic. He was trying to be a husband and father while living a life built on all-night drives and low-paying tours. Those closest to him describe a man who could be charming and vulnerable one moment, and then suddenly violent or paranoid the next. Mood swings fed by pain, drink, and the long grind of feeling forgotten by the business that had once chased him. The most public glimpse of Gene Vincent's private violence came in September of 1963 in London. That day, newspapers reported that the 28-year-old American rock singer was charged with possessing firearms after an incident in which he allegedly pointed a gun at his wife and threatened to kill her. In court, the prosecution described a drunken argument that escalated until Gene pulled out a handgun. Margaret testified that she had forgiven him. The court ultimately fined Gene. For the tabloids, it was a sensational story about a faded rock star gone bad. For those around Gene, it was another sign that the man whose records they loved was dangerous to be around. The case was not an isolated flash of temper. Accounts from fellow musicians and biographers suggest that Vincent's drinking and volatility often spilled over into threats with firearms. According to multiple sources, during a UK tour, he once pulled a gun on his bassist, Jet Harris, backstage. Harris reportedly hid behind singer John Layton until the situation was diffused, and the three later made peace. In 1968, at a hotel in Germany, things escalated further. Gene had been booked on a bill with British pop singer Paul Raven, the man who would later be known as Gary Glitter. During that tour, Vincent, drunk and enraged, allegedly drew a gun and fired several shots at Raven in a hotel, missing him barely. According to later accounts, Raven fled the country in fear the next day. There were also stories collected by later writers and podcasters of Gene threatening or firing guns at a fan outside his hotel, his wife Margaret on a separate occasion, and even producer Paul Rothchild and drummer John Densmore of The Doors, when they were present at a Los Angeles session and wouldn't keep quiet. During the making of his 1969 album, I'm Back and I'm Proud, he reportedly threatened to retrieve a gun from his car and shoot Rothchild and Densmore if they didn't leave the studio. They left and recording continued. But these aren't just the wild, almost cartoonish antics of a young rock and roller throwing TV sets out of hotel windows. They're the actions of a man decades into a pattern of heavy drinking, painkillers, mood swings, and escalating rage, wielding real guns around real people. By the late 1960s, Gene Vincent was trying, in his own unsteady way, to start over. There were attempts to recast himself in folk rock and country rock, recording in Los Angeles and singing to labels like Dandelion and Kama Sutra, cutting albums such as I'm Back and I'm Proud, If Only You Could See Me Today, and The Day the World Turned Blue. Critics and later historians would find flashes of honesty and heartbreak in these records, but the wider public barely noticed them. The man making those albums was in his early 30s, but he looked older. Years of long-term alcohol and pill abuse had left him bloated, tired, and financially precarious. In 1970, broke, in pain, and still drinking, Gene Vincent was given one more shot in the studio. In 1971, he flew back to Britain one more time for a short run of dates, cutting a handful of BBC radio tracks. When he returned to the United States in October of 1971, he went to visit his father, who was living in California. Years of injury, poor diet, heavy drinking, and pills had left him in fragile shape. On October 12, 1971, he collapsed, suffering from what doctors would later list as a ruptured stomach ulcer, internal hemorrhage, and heart failure. Gene Vincent died that day at Eternal Valley Hospital at just 36 years old. He was buried at Eternal Valley Memorial Park, far from Norfolk, far from the English theaters where kids had screamed his name, far from the studios where he'd once traded verses. There was no state funeral, no massive TV special. Rock and roll had already rushed forward to new stars and new scandals. But the people who loved his music did not forget. In the years after 1971, Gene Vincent's reputation grew, even as his physical presence disappeared. Rock critics and historians began to go back to the original records. They heard past the jukebox novelty of Be-Bop-A-Lula and realized how much was happening in those Capitol records. The echo-drenched voice, the wild precision of the Blue Caps, the way Vincent seemed to stand slightly apart from the beat, as if he were leaning on something only he could feel. Writers made the case that whatever the charts might say, Gene Vincent belonged in the same breath as Elvis, Little Richard, and Chuck Berry. In 1997, he was the first inductee into the Rockabilly Hall of Fame, and Rolling Stone eventually placed Be-Bop-A-Lula among its list of the 500 greatest songs of all time, noting it as a foundational rockabilly recording. Punk bands heard in him a template: short songs, big attitude, no apologies. When you strip away the myth, when you look past the leather, the limp, the gun stories, the shattered marriages, what's left is a man who came home from the Navy with a ruined leg and turned it into a stage presence, helped invent a language of echo and tension that rock singers still use today, and spent the rest of his short life trying to outrun his own pain, using amplifiers and applause. He may not have survived it, but the records did.
Well, I got a little woman called Crazy Legs. She's the queen of the teenage crowd. I haul a cat, stuff the nickels in the old jukebox just to watch her do the bop when the music gets loud. Crazy legs, a bopping all over the floor.